Okay. It's our great pleasure this afternoon to have Dr. Stéphane Pradines from the Aga Khan University. He is a professor of Islamic art and architecture there, and his area of specialization is Islamic archaeology, particularly of the Swahili Coast and of sub-Saharan Africa, of the Indian Ocean trade, particularly before 1800. You've also worked on questions of trade and military cultures of war and the kind of material remains that exist for archaeologists to work on. He is also the founding editor of the Journal of Material Cultures in the Muslim World, which is also published from the Aga Khan University by Brill, in partnership with Brill. And we've come across his work through looking at coral architecture, corals which are used in making various buildings in the Swahili Coast in East Africa, in places which are much farther afield, or the corals come from much farther afield in Sri Lanka or Mauritius or other places. And of course, this is something that I found absolutely fascinating, that the way he makes these connections across very, very vast oceanic spaces, but to look at the similarities in building styles and the motifs, and what it tells us about the people and the cultures who, created these in pre-modern times, right? And we've been also thinking in various ways about partnering with the Aga Khan University. They have a fantastic master's program that they were just telling us about. And, it's right in the middle of London, right next to the British Library, for those of you who are familiar. And one of the things we would like to think of with students and faculty is to think of exchanges with the university. And, this is something that Stéphane is here, and along with Ed, and we are very grateful to host you here and to have you as our guests. I don't want to take too much time. Stéphane has about 40 minutes prepared. He has all these wonderful images that he's going to show you, and we can have Q&A after the presentation, right? Okay, we'll leave about 15-20 minutes at the end. So without further ado, here's Stéphane.
Thank you very much, Uday, for this presentation, and thank you for having us in Georgetown University today. So I will try to present my research in not a funny way, but in a fun way, so it won't be too boring, this kind of academic, presentation. So I will balance between science and travels, So I will focus today on my archaeological research that I don't want to say mine, in fact, our archaeological research that we did in East Africa, because when you do an excavation, it's never by yourself. You have a team of workers, students, specialists, and so on. And so I will focus on different sites that I excavated since the past, more than 20 years. And so I will present you different sites in Kenya, Tanzania, but also Comoros Island. So I don't know if I move this one. Yes. So maybe what I should do first is a small introduction to the Swahili Coast. So the Swahili Coast, in fact, from the Arabic, Sahel, the shore. The Swahili Coast, in fact, is a stretch of land, coastal land, from Mogadishu in Somalia up to Sofala in the present-day Mozambique. But you have also Swahili in Comoros Island, and the north of Madagascar. So it is a culture. It's a mix of a population. So you don't have one particular type of Swahili. The Swahili are a mix of people. They are Africans, of course, but you have Bantu Africans, you have Nilotic Africans, in Somalia and northern Kenya, and they mixed up with people from the Indian Oceans. So with Indian from India, from present-day Pakistan in the Sindh, but also people from Oman and Yemen, and also Arabs from the Red Sea and the Gulf. It is a culture, and this culture, you can see on the coast the traces of this culture with the architecture. The Swahili, they have a particular kind of architecture that Uday mentioned, with coral stones. They have also their own way of dressing, their own clothes, their own objects, their own material culture. And today, in the presentation today, I will insist on the early period of the Swahili, the beginning of Islam on the coast, and the traces, the evidences of the trade and the cultural connections between East Africa, the Swahili Coast, and the rest of the Indian Ocean world. You can see that we can go very far up to China. Of course, needless to say that the Swahili are Muslims. Needless, but very important to mention. The Swahili, it's not like the Romans or the Sasanians, or they are not dead. It's a living culture. It's the reason why I didn't write who were the Swahili, but who are the Swahili. You probably know Zanzibar. It's one of the most famous Swahili city. But the Zanzibar that you can see today, it's a city from the 19th century because it was what we call the re-Arabization of the coast when the Omani came back to East Africa, the coast. I said came back because they were in East Africa since the very early period, probably 9th to 10th century of our era. But so it's very interesting to see that the Swahili are really multicultural as Africans, but also depending of other Indian Ocean cultures. I forgot to mention, of course, the Persians. They are part also of the Swahili culture. The Swahili, they are mainly because of their location on the coast, they are and they were fishermen, sailors, and traders, merchants. Here you have, it's a very brief, synthetic kind of timetable, chronology, of the different, the Islamic period in East Africa. I'm not talking about the late antiquity. I won't talk about the colonial period. It's not my interest and my discipline. But I'm focusing on the Islamic period, what we call Islamic period or medieval period or modern period, if you wish. And we will focus today, in particular, as I said to you, on the early Islamic period. So the Abbasid period, that I call the age of discoveries, when the Muslims, they expanded, their empire, in the Indian Ocean. And I will focus also on up to the early 13th century. Why? Because a lot of change happened in the early 13th century. For example, the coast before the early 13th century, most of the Muslims on the coast, they were Shia or Ibadi. And then in the early 13th century, most of the people became Sunni Shafi. So basically, and it's quite logic because also in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, the Saladin ended the Fatimid dynasty, and then you had like a kind of Sunni so-called domination, of the Muslim world. And it happened also in East Africa. So here you can see it's a classic. You probably know that. Of course, the professors, yes, and the students, maybe, as we say, I don't know, in Egypt, inshallah, maybe the main products produced by the Swahili. The Swahili, the Africans, they exported mainly what we call raw products, what I call raw products, like natural products. So ivory, gold, rock crystal. And from time to time, my colleagues, they don't like to speak about that because they want to show only the positive aspect, of a culture. And it's not that they ignore it, but I would like to mention one important part of the Swahili economy, it's the slavery and the slave trade. And it is something very ancient we can go up to the antiquity, probably Bronze Age, but Roman, Sasanian period, until the 19th century, the Sultanate of Zanzibar and the Omani. So slavery was part of the trade, of course. They exported also other natural products, such as, for example, the wood. It is something quite important, especially in the Arabian Peninsula, for example. They exported natural products like turtle scales from the Comoros Island, what they call the Zanjian skins, in the primary sources, but the leopard skins, and all these animal skins, and also copal gums that I found in my excavations in Kenya, and also amber or ambergris from the sperm whale. They imported, in exchange to the natural products that they were selling to the Muslim world, but also to Asia, they imported mainly manufactured products. So fabrics, printed textile, silks from India, China. They imported porcelain, ceramics from China, also ceramics from the rest of the Arab world, from Yemen, from Oman, I will come back, and also beads and glass. Here is just two pictures about one particular object characteristic of the Swahili culture that they continue to use, for ceremonial festivities and so on. It's what we call Oliphant. We have also Oliphant, in the Christian, Western culture. It's a blowhorn, but it's a side blowhorn. So you don't use, I don't know if I can use that. You don't blow here, but you blow on the side. You have a hole on the side. And it's very interesting to me because, by a matter of fact, I'm also a specialist of Cairo, Egypt, and I work on the Fatimids. And you have Oliphant, in the Fatimid culture, from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. And it's very interesting because the Fatimids from Egypt and the Red Sea, they were connected to East Africa. We don't know where this fashion of Oliphant came to East Africa, but it's something that I investigated a little bit few years ago because the Fatimids were selling ivory to Egypt, and the Egyptians, the Fatimids, they probably exported not only objects but idea, cultural idea, to the East, to East Africa. So these Oliphant are, I think, to my eyes, extremely interesting because they are the symbol of this exchange between manufactured products, ivory, and idea, or objects. And these objects are extremely important for the Swahili because, as I said, they are objects used for ceremonies, like, for example, weddings, procession, of the king of the town, and so on. So they are very important, and they are called siwa. So I was interested also by what we call the southern markets, the kingdoms and the places to the south of the Swahili Coast. I forgot to mention something. We don't have a Swahili kingdom. So basically, the Swahilis, they are a culture, but each Swahili city, for example, in Kenya, Mombasa, or Malindi, or Kilwa in Tanzania, they were city-states, like the Italian, cities like Pisa, Venice, and so on. They were city-states, and each of them, they had a malfe, it's a kind of chief in Kiswahili, or a sultan. And so it's very interesting because I will describe after a few Swahili city-states. And of course, each city-state, it was a port, harbor, and they had the control on some territories. And for example, the city-state of Kilwa was in control of the southern territories, and the gold mine of the Great Zimbabwe was called later, after the 16th century, Mwene Motapa. And so Kilwa became a very rich city because they had the monopoly of the gold trade. And one of the discoveries that I did with my team is, in fact, Kilwa became a very rich city, port city, not only because of the gold trade, but also because of the rock crystal trade from Madagascar. So I will talk about that later. So here you have the location, because I'm not sure that you have a lot of Africanists in the room, and so I need to locate, the Great Zimbabwe. In the actual Zimbabwe, actually, it's nice to have an African country who is connected to an old African kingdom and not connected to post-colonial division and geography. You can see still the post-colonial straight lines of the borders of Africa. And you can see a little bit the architecture of the palace so-called palace, the house of the king, of Green Zimbabwe, and the kind of gold objects like this rhinoceros that they found in the area. So they were producing, they were mining gold that they were they transported the gold to the coast to sell the gold to the Swahili from Kilwa. Here you have the main medieval city of the coast was Kilwa. Kilwa is located to the south of Tanzania. It was one of the main city-states of the Swahili Coast. Now, today we talk about Zanzibar, but Zanzibar is a very big city from the 18th, 19th century. And during the medieval period, Kilwa was one of the biggest port city of the Swahili. And so I was working there in Kilwa Kisiwani with the people, my colleague, friend, in fact, I know them since 20 years, so I think after 20 years we can consider that we are friends, from Kilwa Kisiwani. And I was working also on another site in the Kilwa Bay or archipelago, because they have many islands, Songomnara and also Sanjayakati. I will come back on these two sites later. You can see in Kilwa you have a lot of monuments, and you have a monument which is very characteristic, of the trade. You have the same on the Silk Road. It is called the Caravanserai. Caravanserai or Khan, it is a place where you can protect goods and travelers, like valuable objects or gold, for example, and also the travelers. So here you have a beautiful caravanserai called the Usuni and Dogo. Maybe you have some people who speak Arabic here. Usuni, Isn is the castle, And so, and Dogo, because in Kiswahili it's a small castle. I will show you the big one, because it's already a big one, but they have bigger than that. And so it's interesting to see that the Swahilis, they adopted, the caravanserai on the coast to protect their products. 13th century. And then the Sultan in Kilwa probably was tired to live in a boring castle, with no facilities. So he decided to build, this sumptuous palace on the top of the cliff. So I don't know how much he paid, but he had a beautiful sea view with a swimming pool here, a pool. And attached to it, because probably he was not very, he didn't trust very much, his people, he connected the new caravanserai to the palace. So this kind of palace, it's like an economic hub, a palace, and also an administrative, building, with audience hall or court, here, a kind of diwan, if you wish. So this is for the palace of Usuni Kubwa, the big palace, 14th, 15th century. And this kind of monuments, they show you all the Swahili, how rich were the Swahili. And so it's very, very interesting to look at the architecture, not only the objects. So I try to divide, because we are all watching, Netflix and so on. So I try to make it like episode, like a series. Chapter 1 in the Kenyan jungle. I told you that I would try to be a bit funny. Kenyan jungle, Gedi, it's a site in Kenya, close to Malindi, to the north of Mombasa. It's probably the most beautiful site in Kenya. The ruins in the middle of the jungle. All the people who visited these places, they told me, it looks like Angkor Wat and other places like that. So we excavated from 1999 to 2003. Basically, the site was already excavated by a British archaeologist named Kirkman in the 50s. But he excavated only one part of the site, and maybe like 20%. So we continue the excavations, and I didn't finish the excavation, so probably more archaeologists will come later. I wish them good luck. But me, I had enough. I spent a few years, enough to publish one book. So, and it's a beautiful site in the jungle. We did a new plan of the site. You can see that from time to time people, they think, the archaeologists, they need to dig. In this kind of site, you don't need to dig. Because in fact, the ruins, the houses, the mosque, because it's a site with 9 mosques, they are still preserved in elevation. You need to cut the jungle, the forest, to clear the monuments. Of course, we had some problems, because there is, sorry for my British colleague, Edouard, a society of old British ladies living in Malindi. They came to me and they said, "What are you doing? You are destroying your forest." I said, "Yes, but me, I prefer the ruins and the forest." So I had a lot of problems, because it was difficult to know the fight between nature and culture. So I tried to keep the trees. We didn't harm any monkeys on the trees, but we cleaned the jungle. And of course, we had all the snakes that you can imagine. Black, green mamba. The green mamba are bad because they are falling from, they are living in the trees, they are falling on your head. I remember we had journalists, they were absolutely, they were very, very afraid. And I told them, don't put your hand in the walls because it's where we have the black mamba. Anyway, all these stories are true. And we had, of course, fighting cobras and so on. So here you have the new map of the cities that we did. We excavated many places. Sorry. Yeah. Including a great mosque. The first great mosque excavated by James Kirkman was this one from the 15th century, but in fact, he haven't seen that in fact the old settlement was to the north, and we excavated this mosque from the 14th century, and under the mosque of the 14th century, we found a mosque from the 13th century, and under the mosque of the 13th century, we found a mosque of the 11th century. And we excavated several houses. I will show you that later. Here you have the excavation in the mosque. And you can see, okay, archaeology, okay. Archaeology is like the British Bake Off, you know, with cakes, with layers. So if you want to understand the previous occupation or layer, you have to remove the top layers. So basically, when we dig, it's like a book. When you read a book, normally, you start by the beginning. It's exactly what we did. So we excavated the mosque of the 14th century, and under we found a mosque of the 13th century, and under, you see the floor, we found a mosque of the 11th century. We found a lot of ceramics, and these ceramics are the witness, the testimonies of the trade in the Indian Ocean. So here you have what we call black on yellow or mustard ware from Yemen, 13th century. From time to time, we are very lucky. You can find this kind of, in the Qatar Museum, a Kashan ceramic from Iran, 13th century. A lot of nice pieces. Here in the house 15, we excavated, it's another bad thing about archaeologists, we like pit latrines. And why? Because the best things are always in the toilets. People are forgetting things, losing things in the toilet, like what we do today. And so it's always fantastic to excavate toilets, pit latrines. We found ivory pieces, quite well preserved actually, like the ones that you can see here. And chapter 2, Tanzanian adventure. So a few years later, I was asked by the UNESCO and the World Monument Fund to work in Kilwa. And as I said to you, Kilwa is one of the best Swahili sites. So, of course, I accepted the mission because when someone gives you one of the best Swahili sites of the coast, you cannot refuse. You can see that here, I had a team with the British Institute, Kenyan, Tanzanian, people from Uganda, people, of course, from, as you probably noticed, from France. Here you have these two poor Spanish students probably terrorized. And that's it. So here we are in Kilwa. So Kilwa is to the south of the Tanzanian coast. So here you have Zanzibar. Here now I have new excavations in Kua, in Mafia. And Kilwa is the border between Tanzania and Mozambique. It's here. So here, Kilwa is really to the south of Tanzania. Yes, working in East Africa look like a romantic thing, fun, you know, the beach. But in fact, we camp, you know, and it's a bit tough because the island, we don't have electricity, running water. We have to import even the water, not only to drink, but to wash. So it is something complicated. Saying that, working on the coast, we had like lobster every 2 days, red snapper, a big tuna, and so the life was not completely so difficult as you can imagine. And especially because I was working at that time, I was based in Egypt, in Cairo, and I had the possibility to import our own shisha, water pipe, so the life was okay in the end. Sorry, is there a problem?
Just stay close to the mic.
Sorry, yes. I'm a bit dramatic in my description, so I try to be. So, yes. So here you can see one of the mosques that we excavated in Tanzania, so close to Kilwa, the site that I showed you previously, Sanjay Yakati. This mosque is very interesting because it's an old mosque, 11th, 12th century, but compared to the one that I showed you in Gedi, this mosque is still quite well preserved. You can see the wall, you can see the niche, you see, of the mihrab here. And this mosque is interesting, yes, because it's a good mosque and it's a good site of the 11th and the 12th century. And we found a lot of ceramics from this period, from 11th, 12th century, a lot of what we call stoneware, Chinese stoneware, not porcelain, because the porcelain was invented later, from China, of course, and a lot of Persian hatchets graffiatos that you can see here. And I come back to the title of this presentation, is the fact that the Persian Gulf, we are in Doha, the Arab Gulf, or the Gulf in general, was a very important hub with East Africa for the trade. And so it's the reason why I would like today to insist on the fact that the ceramics coming from the Gulf are the ones who are extremely present in East Africa. So basically, when you dig in East Africa, you won't find Egyptian or ceramic from the Red Sea, but you will find mainly objects from the Gulf. And it's interesting because when you look at the narrative or you look at the primary sources, you can see that the Red Sea is very important. But when you are an archaeologist, you say, wait a minute, okay, the Fatimids, they knew East Africa. We had trade, with East Africa coming from Egypt and the Red Sea, but the objects, the trade, was mainly something coming from the Gulf. So I think it's extremely interesting. Things changed later, of course, during what we call the Mamluk period, 13, 14. But as I said to you, when they started to introduce, the Sunnism, Shafi, Sunnism, and also new networks, new trading routes were established. So probably for me, the change is early 13th century and for sure 14th century. But before what I call early Islam, everything was really with the Gulf. Here, chapter 3. I don't have 20 chapters, don't worry. Tanzania, from Tanzania to the Comoros Archipelago. So the Comoros Archipelago are located in between Tanzania and Madagascar. In a way, it's like a bridge. So when you are a sailor, you need to have access to what? You need to have access to food and, more importantly, water. So it's normal to do some breaks, and to have some stopovers. And of course, the Comoros Archipelago, they were like the perfect bridge between Madagascar and Tanzania. And we have many archaeological sites in the Comoros, and one of these sites is a site that I excavated in Mayotte. It's a very strange story. It's a kind of post-colonial story that you probably heard. The Comoros are a country with, in fact, the Comoro Archipelago, it's 4 islands. 3 countries decided to be independent from France, and one country, one island, decided to stay with France. So it's a bit strange because today, the Comoros Archipelago, you have a country with 3 islands, and one, it's a French department. Don't ask me any explanation about that. It was the wish of the people. But actually, to do research as a French archaeologist is absolutely fantastic because you get the French funding from the Ministry of Culture. And also it's, in a way, like maybe from time to time in Qatar or in Doha, it's very political because the French government invested a lot of money in Mayotte, but also in La Réunion Island, behind Madagascar, and from time to time also in Mauritius, because of the colonial past of France and because La Réunion is also a French island. So they wanted to develop the idea that people from Mayotte and La Réunion are French, but they are also part of the Indian Ocean culture. So it's very important, this duality of identity of the people in Mayotte. And I remember, because I was in Mayotte, I have another French, I was in Mayotte when Mayotte became a French department. And my colleague and friends from Mayotte, they told me, oh, we are so happy to be a French department, but it's horrible because now the polygamy is forbidden and we will have only one wife. I say, well, poor you, it's a French department, I cannot do anything about it. So here you have early Abbasid contacts. You all know Sinbad the Sailor. Sinbad the Sailor, the Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights, and the Caliph Al-Rashid, thank you very much. So Sinbad the Sailor, for me, as an archaeologist, it's something very interesting because these tales are based on real stories, the stories of mariners, people who travel in the Indian Ocean and brought back to Shiraz, Baghdad, or Samarra before, the stories of the things that they saw. And when you are a traveler or a Persian traveler and you go to Madagascar and you can see this giant ostrich that they have, in Madagascar. I don't know if you have seen an ostrich, but it's a quite big bird. In Madagascar, the size of this ostrich was twice the size of the normal ostrich today. So if you are a Persian traveler and you are facing this giant ostrich, you will be terrorized. And then when you come back to Baghdad or Samarra, you will tell, the stories, the tales, of this rock bird who was able, to catch, and carry elephants, as you can see here with the rock bird. You have also the stories of the cannibals with dog heads. Most probably they saw what we call lemurs, this kind of the lemurs that you have in Madagascar, this kind of monkeys. They are not monkeys, but the lemurs. And so probably we have also the story of the wak-wak. The wak-wak, the tree with the speaking heads. And in fact, coconuts, most probably. And so it's very interesting because you have a lot of legend and tales and stories, coming from the Sinbad the Sailor, but they are connected to real stories, of these Persian travelers. And, I like American movies. I'm so sorry. Maybe you like also some old 50s movies. But Sinbad the Sailor, it's very interesting for that. And it's so exciting when you can connect archaeological excavations and discoveries to the myth, to the tale. And it's exactly what happened when we did the excavation in Mayotte. You have the island of Mayotte here, with the town of Dembeni, and the site is just above the modern town of Dembeni. So we did, again, a map of the site. It's something that I did all my life because the problem with archaeologists, I'm one of them, but they dig, and sometimes they don't start by doing a map. I like to do a map because I like to know where I dig, to have the size of the site and so on. And it is good to have also a strategy because sometimes the people, they tell me, you managed to find these things. I say, yes, but I was very patient. We started to do some drawing, some survey, and then we dug. Some archaeologists, they arrive in, Qatar or Egypt, and they start to dig. They don't have a kind of large planning about how they manage the archaeological site. Here you can see the team, a part of the team digging on the site. Mayotte is a volcanic island, so it's a bit different from the coast, Kenya, Tanzania. So you can see here volcanic basaltic stones, So they are different kind of building material. And the site of Dembeni is a very interesting site because you don't have any architectural remains on the ground. You see the site that I showed you before? You can see mosques, palaces, and so on. So you have nothing visible, but when you start to dig, you have meters of layers, of stratigraphy. And the most important, we have an amazing archaeological material. So we have a lot of ceramics, beautiful ceramics, and extremely old ceramics. I'm talking now not about 11, 12, I'm talking about 8, 10th century. And the archaeologists who worked on this site before, they couldn't explain that. They tried, they had a lot of theories. The problem is theories, we are all researchers, scientists, we can have theories, but at one point you need to demonstrate or to prove that your theories are right or wrong. Here you have so-called Sasanian, in fact it's late, early Islamic, Abbasid turquoise storage here. You have some of them in the National Museum in Qatar. You have Abbasid ceramics, it's called also Samarra ceramic, Lustredware from the Abbasid period. Here also is kind of cream with gold decorations. And so it's interesting to see, and very early Chinese ceramic, 10th, 11th century. And it's interesting because how come a site like that, in the middle, not of nowhere, but so far from the main, Swahili sites, Kenya, Tanzania, had so many beautiful products. Here you have the site, I forgot to mention, the site was occupied from the 9th century to the end of the 12th, and then was abandoned. So already it's a clue, because This site was abandoned when the trading network changed. So early, I told you the Sunni in the 13th century. And the site started to be used in the Abbasid period. So we have a site was extremely rich and developed between the Abbasid and the Fatimid period. So, we had the chronology, we have something. But still, we didn't know how come these people became so rich that they could import, Chinese, Abbasid ceramic, and so on. And we found it. It was not my, actually, I have to tell you something else. When I went to Mayotte, it was not my primary research. So I was not concerned, not interested by rock crystal. I was interested by urbanization, the first settlement, Swahili settlement. But also when you are a researcher, I think you need to adapt your strategy to the site and not the opposite. But unfortunately, a lot of people, they do the opposite. They want the site to say what they want. And here we found a lot of rock crystal. First problem that we had, there is no rock crystal in the Comoros, in Mayotte. So this rock crystal do not originate from Madagascar. So, but we have a lot of rock crystal, do not originate from Comoros, from Mayotte. But we have a lot of rock crystal in Madagascar. So here you can see all the rock crystal pieces that we found, flakes, and pieces of rock crystal. And as I said to you, we don't have any rock crystal, natural rock crystal, in the Comoros Island. But we have rock crystal in Madagascar. And actually, Madagascar is one of the most famous countries for rock crystal. Even today, the Chinese are traveling to Madagascar to buy huge pieces of rock crystal. And I don't know, on this map you cannot see. I mentioned, the French island of La Réunion. You see Madagascar, probably the island will be something, to the east. I found all the text, French text, of the governor of La Réunion, who was called Il Bourbon. And he ordered his people to go to Madagascar to bring rock crystal pieces to do a dining table. Dining table, you need to have serious rock crystal pieces. So it's just to show you how Madagascar was a very important country for the rock crystal. And then you have another important thing. It's the purity. Why Chinese are going now to Madagascar to buy rock crystal? Rock crystal, you have rock crystal almost, not anywhere, but you have rock crystal in different parts of the world. But it's about the purity. The rock crystal has to be very transparent, without bubbles, or like what we call the milky rock crystal, Sometimes to time they are a bit, not transparent enough for to produce, nice quality objects. But in Madagascar, you have a lot of beautiful pieces of transparent rock crystal. Here you can see the mines. And look at this nice photo from a rock crystal specialist in London. You can see the size of this block of rock crystal. You can do some amazing pieces, with this rock crystal. And I invite you to go to the Islamic Art Museum when they will reopen, because if I remember, they have rock crystal pieces. So this rock crystal was bought by the Abbasids, and then Abbasid Caliphate here, and Fatimid Caliphate. So capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. What's happened with my map? Yes, you see Basra. Basra was a port of the Abbasid Caliphate. So please move in your head this point to the end of the Gulf. Basra should be here. And of course, the capital city of the Abbasid, Samarra and Baghdad, or Baghdad and Samarra, if you wish. So this rock crystal was sold to the Abbasids and later to the Fatimids. And the rock crystal, we have primary sources. They said about the price of the rock crystal. The rock crystal the value was equal, if not more, to the gold. So it was a very expensive material. And they produce, as you can see, this ewer here, Fatimid ewers. Also here it's a chess piece. And you have bottle, I don't know if you use that in Qatar, for the coal, the coal for the eyes. And, not incense. The coal, this black for the makeup, but coal. Sorry for my pronunciation. And so these bottles, these rock crystals, were used only by rich people who could afford to buy rock crystal. The elite, prince, Fatimid princes, or noble, or rich families. Here you can see some Fatimid earware, made of rock crystal. And I think for us, it was an important discovery because in the Fatimid sources, they mention, rock crystal from Badakhshan. They mention rock crystal from even North Africa, but they say, I think it was Nasir Osro. They say that the best rock crystal is coming from the Ganj, from East Africa. So it's so interesting to see that you can say a lot with a material like the rock crystal. And as a kind of conclusion, I would like to mention that the rock crystal is a witness of these early trading systems, but also, when the Abbasid Caliphate declined, and then it was a rise, of the Fatimid Caliphate. So, and we know, because we have a lot of articles and books from art historians, that what we call the lustred ware, the lustred ceramic, was invented in Samarra and Baghdad. And the technology, when the Abbasid Caliphate declined, the potters, the craftsmen, they moved from Baghdad to Cairo, and they brought their technology with them. And it is the same with the rock crystal, and it is also the same with the glass. You see this turquoise, it's not a ceramic, it's a glass. But forget about the gold and the stone, because these kind of objects were reused in churches, in Italy, Venice, or also the one that you have in the Louvre Museum, is coming from Saint-Denis, the Basilica of Saint-Denis. So, but what is interesting with the glass is the technique. The craftsmen cut the glass. So it's like carve. Exactly the same technique that the craftsmen used to cut and polish, the rock crystal. So you have people, artists, because, also with Islamic art, I can talk for 2 hours about if they were artists or craftsmen, probably both. They moved from Baghdad to Cairo. So you have some technologies and artistic production moving in the Indian Ocean from the Gulf to the Indian Ocean up to the Red Sea. So I think it's what I wanted to show you today.
Stéphane,
yep.
Just a minute. So for the rock crystal,
yes.
Was it primarily the technology basically was in Baghdad and Cairo?
Yes.
Egyptian craftsmanship?
Yeah, what most of my colleagues, because on this point, art history point, I rely also on the publications of my colleague. I would say Anna Contandini for the SOAS and Jonathan Bloom in US. And the narrative or the explanation is to say that the people move with their technology and their know-how, their knowledge, from the Abbasid Caliphate to Egypt. Because there is a difference in chronology. So basically, the objects were produced between the 8th and the 10th century, and they were then later produced in Egypt under the Fatimid Caliphate, 11th, 10th century. But your question is a good question, because in fact, these are always, publications, done by specialists, but we have to demonstrate that these people, they move, because sometimes it's only the ideas. But the fact that these technologies are so difficult, even nowadays, that most probably people also move, because unless you train people and they're at school, the people who did this rock crystal in Cairo, they had the same quality, the same level of the one that you can find in the Abbasid Caliphate. And so I think, yes, it is more or less the end of my presentation, and I'm ready if there is a Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead. Rogaya has a question.
Stéphane, thank you so much. This is absolutely fantastic. What is next for you in terms of the things?
Next for me, okay. I have more joke in my basket, in my pocket. Next for me, I have this site of Kua that I mentioned. It's in Mafia. It's not in Italy, it's in Tanzania. Okay, first joke. Mafia, and this is a beautiful site, and we do some excavations with the Tanzanian Antiquities and the World Monument Fund. But the site the access to the site is very difficult because even, at the low tide, you have to walk in the sea with the silk, the mud, and the mangrove. And last time in 2018, because it was before the COVID, I realized that I had a lot of energy 15, 20 years ago. And last time I was in Tanzania, going to the well with my bucket to have a small cold shower. And I realized that I start to be a bit tired. and it's about logistics. So actually, to be honest with you, I'm focusing only on one excavation that I have. So I finished my excavation a long time ago in Egypt. And now I have only one big project. It's with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, completely, totally different country. We are doing the excavation of the fort of Lahore, the Mughal fort of Lahore in Pakistan. So it's, and I come back to my nice Pakistani hotel every night with my hot shower water. It's fantastic. So you're welcome.
Shahir?
Thank you, Professor, for this wonderful presentation. I'd like to know more about the Swahili language. When I was in the Cambridge education system, you'd go to the website. Swahili was one of the first languages that would pop up. So could you tell me a bit more about its origins, its inflections, and its relevance today?
Yes, I can. Despite the fact that I'm not a linguist, you probably realize I lived in Egypt for 11 years, but my Arabic is terrible, but I'm doing my best. So I'm speaking a bit of Swahili, Kiswahili. What we know about the Kiswahili is the fact that it is an African language, for sure. It's mainly Bantu. But you have also, I like to talk about, the things that from time to time you cannot find in books, like politics, and competitions, between nations. There is some dispute between Kenyan researchers and Tanzanian researchers. The Tanzanian are for the Bantu origin of the Swahili and the Kiswahili, and the Kenyan, because of the northern Kenya, they are for the Nilotic. So there is a discussion about also, of course it is a Bantu language. And I have to take care with the student because immediately you will go on Google and you will Google Kiswahili and you will have a lot of information. But you need to be very careful. Kiswahili Bantu, African, with a bit of Nilotic. But the most important also is most of the people who speak Arabic, you will feel comfortable when you travel to East Africa because you have so many words, from Arabic. And also Persian, Farsi. For example, samaki is the fish. You have so many bandarini in Kiswahili, bandar in Farsi, the port. So you have so many words, so you can pick up. What is very funny, these words are always related to the sea, trade, navigation, and the sea culture. So it is the reason why. But when you go in depth, I can give you an example with the ivory. I look at the ivory word, there is no word connected to the Arabic. It is a Bantu word for Tumbe or Why? Because in fact, the Swahili of the coast, they were buying their ivory to the tribe from the inside, like the Maasai and so on. So basically, the word for ivory is completely different, in Kiswahili, the word for ivory is completely different from the Arabic word. Why? Because there is no common ground. It's not something, the ivory was bought by the Swahili from the hinterland and sold to the Muslim traders. So it's interesting because when you look at the vocabulary, you can go also very, very deep because you can understand the relationship between the Swahili society, between the inside and the sea.
Anto, and then Asma.
Thank you. It was really wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. One point you mentioned earlier, Stéphane, intrigued me quite a bit. You said that based on archaeological finds and studies, there's a new interpretation or reinterpretations about the connection between Swahili Coast more with the Gulf, right? As far as the material cultures found on archaeological sites, contrary to primary sources that point towards connection to the Red Sea.
Yes.
So when I heard that, so historians' knowledge about the region or the interconnection between the two regions have been amended or added by archaeological knowledge.
Yes.
But I'm curious,
Yes. Yes, okay. Okay. Another point of my, personality is from time to time when someone asks me a question, I will give you more questions than answer. So be ready for what I will say. I try to make it short, but in fact it's more complicated than that. Why? Because the Red Sea during the antiquity was connected to the Indian Ocean. If we go back to the Egyptology pharaonic period, the Queen Hatshepsut, in Egypt, they sent, boats to south of the Red Sea to collect, ivory from probably nowadays Sudan or Somalia, okay? And then the Roman, they discovered the first, the wind of the monsoon, and the wind of the monsoon. And so you have Roman settlements in India up to Sri Lanka. So when I said about the Red Sea, I focus in particular for this early Islamic period. Why? Because the Roman Empire fought with the Persians, Sassanians, and then also you had also the Aksumite kingdom in Ethiopia with the port of Adulis on the Red Sea, and so you had this Roman presence and post-Roman presence on the Red Sea. What is interesting is that suddenly this presence, this domination, collapsed in the Red Sea, and for a while, the people of the Gulf, they had all this trading network. When I say the Gulf, it's the Gulf in big. So when I talk about the Gulf, I'm talking about Oman, I'm talking about Bahrain, I'm talking about Yemen. The problem, Yemen is really connected to the Red Sea, exactly. But, and the Persian, Persian, I would like to say Persian Abbasids, so Iran and Iraq. So, and also I would like to include Pakistan. We would say India, Pakistan today. Why? Because the port city of Debul, the Debuli, we call this, there is a site, an archaeological site close to Karachi called Bambor. And this site was extremely important for the trade. So I'm not sure, I will come back to your question. It is very common that archaeology contradicts history. It is also common that sometimes archaeology supports history. I can give you hundreds of examples of archaeologists who contradict or moderate, the thing of the... To come back to, because I can talk about Al-Makrizi in Cairo and things like that, but to come back to the specific topic of the Indian Ocean, I remember that I talked to a researcher called Youssef Rapoport. He published, he edited, a manuscript, Fatimid manuscript about the Indian Ocean. So if you don't have this book in your library, I think you should order it because it's a fantastic. It is called the Guide of the Universe, and the Guide of the Universe. And it's a very interesting manuscript because the Fatimid describe all the places around the Indian Ocean, from Africa to India. And Youssef was very surprised when I was telling him, no, I never found any piece of Fatimid ceramic in East Africa. And because he's an historian, he said to me, yes, but Stéphane, look, he published this huge manuscript, look, they describe, the coast. And I said to him, and I don't think he's still convinced, by me. I said to him, yes, they describe the coast, so they know about the coast, but they never traded on the coast. And I told him, I believe that they have a very good knowledge about the African coast, but me as an archaeologist, because I said that I live in Egypt for 11 years, but I did excavations in Cairo for 16 years. And I had Fatimid ceramic in my hands for 16. So if someone can recognize Fatimid ceramic in East Africa, it's me. I never found a single piece. So it means that it's interesting. We had probably Fatimids going to East Africa, but with the help of Persian or Omani sailors, on Omani boats or Indian boats. It's very interesting because most of the time, historians, like archaeologists, we like to give you a simple narrative. It's A plus B, for example. And me, what I'm saying is that it's probably A plus B plus C. So you have Fatimids traveling to the coast, maybe on Indian boats, with Persian sailors or Bahraini sailors. So the economy on the Indian Ocean for the early Islamic period was much more complicated than what you can find in some historian or archaeologist books. They want to to reduce, the complexity of the networks in the Indian Ocean. Yeah.
I had a few questions. First, why don't we see this sudden interchange starting from Abbasids? Why not Umayyads? Because you're talking about early Islamic period. Was it because of the flowering culture that they promoted? And second, what other lived realities or continuities in material culture do we witness other than the crystal trade in Madagascar and China?
Sorry, I didn't grab the beginning of your second question, yes.
The first one?
The first one is okay, I got it. Yeah.
What other continuities or lived realities do we witness in material culture and their exchange other than the crystal trade between China and Madagascar?
Okay, so they are very, very, very rich questions. So the first one, first I have a funny answer and a serious after. I don't like the Umayyad. I think they are boring. But anyway, why I'm saying that they are boring is because a lot of books and articles have been published about the Umayyads. And the problem of the Umayyads, we say Umayyads and late antiquity. Okay? Or the Umayyad culture is completely connected to the Roman culture with the, the great mosque in Damascus. And the Umayyads, yes, they were connected to the Roman, so they were connected to the Roman world. So they were connected to the Mediterranean Sea. And because with Uday, my colleague Uday, and my colleague at Georgetown University, we work on the Indian Ocean, I'm more interested by Eastern culture. And with the Abbasid, what is really fun for me is the Abbasid, they were connected to the East, Indian Ocean. So for me, when I say it's a joke, but not completely a joke actually, the Umayyads are boring for me because they are built on Roman late antiquity, and they are connected to the Mediterranean world. And also, something very important, if you want to go in depth, and look at the literature and the books, we have in early Islam, from the Arab conquest to the Umayyad, the Arabs were not very good with the control of the sea. And it is during the Abbasid Caliphate that you have this Muslim or Arab expansion, to the ocean. So it's the reason why I have double interest for the Abbasids. For the rest, the continuity, it's so complicated because, the rock crystal, you have a lot of very good rock crystal in India. And then, needless to say, that you have Mughal India. So how come the people, they needed to import, rock crystal from Madagascar if you can have rock crystal from other empires, and kingdom? So it's interesting because from time to time you have a demand, you have networks, and suddenly they will disappear for political reason. Like Salah ad-Din, it was a political reason, it was a religious reason. It was the fact that it was the not Reconquista, it's in Spain, but the fact that they reestablished, or established the Sunnism over the Shia Caliphate, in Bahrain, also in other places. So with this new political system, with this new in Islam you have different groups, and the fact that it was not only the Sunni over the Shia, but it was also the Caliph over the Sultan over the Caliph. So it was more a military regime than a religious regime. And so all these things can explain that you had new trading networks. And the Red Sea, I would like to mention something. Under the Fatimids, they started to deal with Europeans. And to answer to your question, it was the Mamluks in Egypt who did this very strong economic link with the Christian states of Italy. Venice, for example. The contact between Alexandria and Venice was very important, at the point that when Vasco da Gama came in the Indian Ocean, the first to provide cannon and ships to the Mamluks, it was the Italians, from Venice, because they didn't want the Portuguese to disturb their little business, in the Indian Ocean. So.
Professor, you mentioned the power and the role Kilwa played.
Yes.
What are the geographical features other than the presence of Karawan made it so powerful in the dynamics of Kilwa?
The geographical presence, sorry?
What are the geographical features other than the presence of Karawan or just it being on the coast which made Kilwa so powerful there?
Yes, in fact, one first point was the fact that Kilwa was controlling the gold trade and the rock crystal trade. And actually, it's a very good question. Me, as an archaeologist, my explanations are connected to the raw material, to the product exchange. But if you go in depth, I show you one site that I excavated called Sanjay Akati. Sanjay Akati was a site who was the same size as Kilwa Kisiwani. You know, it's in the same area. And so you have always, and a lot of archaeologists, they work on that, we have competition between sites. So Kilwa Kisiwani became the major site, and Sanjay Akati was abandoned when Kilwa started to grow up. So what is interesting, when you look at the Swahili Coast, you have city-states, and when one city-state die, another emerge. You know, it's like, you know, a living thing. You know, it's very interesting. But you have that also on the Indian coast. You have that in the Mediterranean. It's about the fact that you cannot have two superpowers existing next to each other, you know, because they need to have access to the same resources.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. This has been fascinating.
Thank you.
And we are very thankful.
Thank you.
If you want, you know, I have to leave because I have the job interviews to do, but yeah, you guys should interact with each other. If you have any questions, you can take his card and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much today.